Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. I'm happy to see everyone. I'm very honored to be here, both to be speaking this morning and also to be serving as a facilitator throughout this program. And I'm happy to contribute a few thoughts about countering violent extremism in the Horn of Africa to start our series of looks at conflict, different types of conflict in different zones on the continent today. I'll just mention briefly, the Horn of Africa, we talk about the Horn, really, we're talking about Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, and that's kind of the core Horn countries. And then there are other East African countries that are sometimes associated with the Horn. I know you've had a chance to look at this in your syllabus. Just to point out that this zone has some security features that are common to many areas on the continent. Questions about sub-challenges with governance, questions about positions of borders, land use questions, those kinds of things that we see in other sub-regions. And then also some maybe aspects that are rather particular to the Horn. I think there is a history of countries achieving independence in East Africa that we haven't seen in other areas. There's a longer history of the global war on terrorism in the Horn or in East Africa. Maybe arguably a longer history of proxy conflicts between states, those kinds of features that are important to think about when we're trying to think about this specific context. But I know our colleagues who are coming from countries in East Africa and from the Horn will be able to help us think a bit about what's peculiar or particular about this zone. But I really want to talk about violent extremism in that setting and also try to think about it in a bit of a wider way this morning. So I'm going to start my remarks with a relatively simple question that I think actually sits at the heart of countering violent extremism, or CVE, efforts in the Horn and really elsewhere in many ways, which is simply, why do young people join extremist groups in the Horn of Africa? Why do they become members of illegal terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab? This is a question that we often ask when we're thinking about terrorist groups in Africa and elsewhere. And I want to spend most of my time, my formal remarks, just thinking about this question. I'll be happy to address other issues during the Q&A. But there seems to be some really pretty clear policy implications behind this question, which we often hear when we're talking about how can we counter violent extremism. If no new members were to join violent extremist groups, the group's reach and lifespan would be limited. Traditional counterterrorism measures like law enforcement, maybe even wars on terrorism, might eventually, slowly but surely, put the phenomenon to an end. But terrorist groups in Africa, in the Horn, but also in North Africa, in the Sahel, the Sahara, in the Lake Chad Basin, they have managed to persist, literally for decades. In fact, there's sometimes a feeling, I think, among governments that they've killed or captured every single member of a terrorist group several times over. And yet the group persists. There's a certain sense sometimes of futility when it comes to, for example, killing terrorist leadership. No government forces, including the US, have worked to repeatedly take out senior leaders of Al-Shabaab, for example, through drone strikes, through direct action operations during the past decade, for example. So the emir of Al-Shabaab, for example, was changed several times, right? Aden Hashi Airo was killed in 2008. He was replaced by Godani. Ahmed Godani was killed in 2014. He's been replaced by Abu Ubaidah. In the last couple of years, literally, I would say probably dozens of key senior people within the structure of Al-Shabaab, particularly in the Amniyat, the internal security services, have been killed. And yet, the group continues. So the regeneration of terrorist groups, their ability to recruit, is really a critical issue. So why does this happen? I'd like to take a couple thoughts from all of you before I move on. Why do you think young people are joining a group like Al-Shabaab or a similar terrorist group in the Horn or in maybe your country or your sub-region. I think most of us would say there's more than one reason, but maybe in a word or two, what are some of the drivers that you associate with violent extremism? We've got a number of drivers, right? I think there's something to all of these, and there's different ways to categorize them, these so-called drivers of violent extremism. Sometimes we divide them into, for example, individual factors, an experience of traumatic violence, witnessing it. It's actually a strong indicator. Group dynamics, so peer pressure or being involved in a small clique of people who are isolated from the rest of society. Sometimes structural elements like relative deprivation or corruption. I think some of the things that are pointed out here in terms of poverty or lack of education would be those structural elements. That's one way, for example, of dividing up these drivers. But today I decided, when I was preparing my remarks, to try to do something new and to take these drivers and put them in two different categories: the broad or general and the specific. Because it seems to me that no matter how you slice it, there are, first, lots of drivers that lead Africans into terrorist groups, but they also lead them into any number of violent non-state actors. And I think the ones that have been listed here arguably are connected to different violent non-state actors as well. So young people are vulnerable to joining up with violence specialists, as Dr. Lebas called them in our earlier session, in circumstances where the nation-state has either not established a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within its territory, or it's not managed to prevent violent non-state actors from emerging as rival authorities within its territory, or at least some parts of its territory. And so you get people with grievances and needs that the state and society cannot or will not address. So individuals and communities turn to alternatives. And I'd put in this kind of general bucket of drivers then almost all the push and pull factors that we usually identify as leading to terrorism in Africa. So just to briefly list some, large socioeconomic disparities and poverty, lack of opportunities for livelihood and status, marginalization and center-periphery conflicts, corruption, elite impunity, weak state institutions, a lack of the rule of law, a lack of state presence, and physical insecurity. In a nutshell, these are maybe all of the maledictions that come from poor governance. Right? These factors are present in the Horn. One of the readings by Misfin, I think, indicates a lot of these challenges. That's in your syllabus. But I think, as I said, these general factors can lead people to join any number of violent non-state actors. I'm talking about ethnic militias, trafficking networks, separatist organizations, maybe vigilante groups. Remember all of the non-state actors that Colonel Tom Dempsey was talking about in that previous session as well, when he was talking about security sector reform. Some that the states work with, some that they fight against. So these are groups like pastoralist defense groups, gangs like Mungiki in Kenya, armed neighborhood associations, and so on. But what happens if we try to separate out just the so-called violent extremist or terrorist groups? Can we really identify a few specific drivers as well? I think it's quite a bit harder to do. So if we just select for terrorists, that is the non-state actors that intentionally target civilians with physical violence to achieve a political end. And especially if we try to focus just on the number of groups that are inspired by or connected in some way to Al-Qaeda or Daesh. What do we see then? I would say there's about a dozen important organizations of this type on the continent today that are in many of the key conflict zones that we're looking at during our course. One is Al-Shabaab in Somalia, but others, as you know, would be the Islamic State in Libya, for example, AQIM, or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in the Sahel and Sahara, Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin, and so on. Well, it's quite a bit harder to get empirical data on recruitment into those groups. But there have been a few recent studies on member motivations, which are based on interviews with either imprisoned members or former members of such African terrorist groups. Now, these studies aren't perfect, and we can talk about some of the methodological questions involved with them during the Q&A, but what do they show? I would say on the one hand, some of these studies basically affirm the general drivers that I mentioned above. So, for example, in August 2016, the international NGO Mercy Corps published findings from interviews with 47 former Boko Haram members and 27 youth who were actively recruited but resisted. And I can give you references to all the things I'm citing here afterwards. And this study found that recruits were very much like other youth in Nigeria. They joined Boko Haram in order to get access to small loans, to get ahead economically. They joined through a family or friend connection, and they felt justified because they saw the government as corrupt or callous. Another example comes from the Institute for Security Studies, ISS. In the same month, August 2016, they published a brief based on interviews with 63 Malians involved in what they call jihadi organizations, any number of organizations in that area. Here again, they found that many of the general drivers hold. Talked about combinations of unemployment, a need for physical protection, absence of the state. And they pointed out that they did not really find as a driver adherence to religious extremism or radicalization. But some studies that try to compare recruitment into terrorist groups versus other violent non-state actors have actually found some interesting differences. And here I'd point out a study that Annalie Botha, a South African researcher and former police officer, did for ISS in 2014, where she used nearly 200 interviews to contrast members and associates of Al-Shabaab from members and associates of the Mombasa Republican Council, the MRC, which is a kind of separatist movement on the Kenyan coast. If you look at that study, the overall profile of membership is quite similar, but there are some indicators that don't quite match up. When compared to the MRC, joining Al-Shabaab was less of a social act. Al-Shabaab recruits were less likely to inform anyone, especially their parents, that they were going to join this organization. They were also much more likely to join alone rather than within a group of peers. Joining Al-Shabaab was also more of a religiously motivated act. Al-Shabaab recruits were about 4 times as likely to cite religion as the reason for joining. They were also about twice as likely to see all ethnic groups as being equal, because they were not seeing things through an ethnic lens. And nearly a third of Al-Shabaab respondents said they were introduced to the group via a religious figure, whereas not a single member of the MRC joined through a religious connection. So I think this suggests that there are some real differences, which suggest some unique features to recruitment into violent extremist organizations in the Horn, and that might help us understand why young people would join groups like Al-Shabaab or other violent extremist organizations. And I want to turn briefly to them in closing. I want to offer 3 features of violent extremism that seems to attract young people. This is my analysis, and we can discuss it going forward. I think the first specific factor is governing experience. At this point, it has to be recognized that terrorist groups have managed to control and administer considerable territories in the Horn and in some other areas in Africa for months and sometimes even years. And it gives them certain skills in manipulating environments and gaining adherence. And they're able to do that even when they aren't really able to effectively govern. So in some cases, terrorist groups actually have spent more time controlling a territory than the state. This is true in Somalia. So in 2014, the International Crisis Group published its most recent full report on Al-Shabaab, and it has this quote: "After nearly a decade of gaining and exercising power, Al-Shabaab has acquired on-the-job governance experience unmatched by any rival in South Central Somalia." And I think this governing experience shows. For example, al-Shabaab, from what we can tell in our research, has managed to play the clan system well in Somalia. For example, it's been known to enter an area, support weaker or secondary clans in that area to create a certain parity among rival clans, and then offer to step in and reign as an impartial government to end the chaos of rivalry. It's also learned, even if it hasn't been able to truly govern, it's figured out how to benefit from the opportunity to govern. So a Norwegian researcher, Stig Hansen, who has gone regularly to Somalia over the years, wrote a book about al-Shabaab, and he describes how when governing turned out to be too hard, al-Shabaab developed something called the Kormir, or supervision system, where it would conquer a city or a town and drive out transitional federal government forces, mete out what appeared to be rapid justice for a few days, and then it would unilaterally withdraw and reap the reward of enhanced prestige when corrupt government officials and police returned and started to prey on the population. It was like setting up a lived experience, a kind of comparative experiment. I think that's this kind of ability to establish a genuine rival authority to the state in significant swaths of territory is something that other violent non-state actors just don't really have. Traffickers don't have that, for example. I know I'm running short on time, so I will just mention more briefly the other two specific factors. I think a second specific factor is ideological appeal. Many violent extremist groups have developed compelling narratives that recast specific experiences of disempowerment, humiliation, and grievance within a worldview and explanatory narrative that offers a system of meaning, a sense of direction, and a template for action. And I want to say that this narrative, often this ideology is couched in a religious idiom. And I know that the connection between terrorism and religion can be a controversial topic, and it's certainly been used to tarnish entire faith-based communities inappropriately. But I think we have to recognize that terrorist groups connected in some way to al-Qaeda and Daesh are really tapping into deep wells of powerful belief and motivation for young people through the ideology and ideological ideas that they're putting out. And they're doing that on a continent that's, according to most research, the most believing or the most faith-based continent in the world, where people believe. I'll just mention this is also happening in a landscape of shifting religious contexts and belief systems. And I'll just mention that the Africa Center recently published a security brief about developments within the Muslim community in East Africa that may bear your looking at. And then just to finish, I think another unique feature of violent extremist organizations in the Horn is their ability to call on both global and local networks. They're sometimes called global and local organizations. So they're able to gain strength and longevity by connecting to like-minded organizations and movements around the world. Now, transnational organized crime also works through global networks, but I would argue that violent extremists have a stronger commitment both to the global networks, but also to the local context. In the face of pressure and responses, traffickers will often move rather than fight, since their ultimate goal is profit. But I think, by contrast, when the going gets tough for terrorist organizations, they stall. They may redirect recruits to some faraway conflict. They may disperse across borders, but they don't cede claim to their original local context, and ultimately, as long as they exist, they'll go back. I think Somalia remains al-Shabaab's primary focus and battleground, even if it has conducted attacks in neighboring countries. I think it's also true, for example, of Algeria, which has had a terrorist problem for maybe a generation or more since the 90s. So These connections, help to ensure the brand, to guarantee a broader momentum in the struggle when going gets tough, to offer concrete logistical and financial, sometimes personnel support. It's a kind of global resource for local actors to revive and rally under pressure. And that's just not available to other violent non-state actors trying to recruit members, like ethnic organizations, for example. So I wanted to evoke these ideas about what leads people to join violent extremist organizations. There are many other points we can look at going forward, but I think we really need to think critically about some of the basic questions here. What is leading young people to join these organizations? One of the things we're trying to do here is to really encourage critical thinking and really going back to basics and reflecting on what we think we know as the sources of insecurity and instability, so that when we start again, and as you rise to take the positions of senior leaders in your institutions, we make sure that we're working from a strong understanding of the challenge and developing the best possible solutions. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks very much for your attention.